Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute, creating better conversations about the essential questions facing Jewish life. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're recording on Monday, February 17th, 2025. So I'm actually recording today's episode together with my guest in the outskirts of London. We are participating in the beginning of what seems like an experimental and exciting project entitled the London Initiative. Its tagline is Shaping a Better Shared Future for World Jewry, All Israelis and Israel. A deeply aspirational position, one that I hold to, one that our heart ministry cares about. What this retreat represents is the bringing together of about 60 individuals from NGOs, from the political sector, American Jews, European Jews, Israelis, both Jewish and Palestinian, from various sectors of Israeli society who all largely share a hypothesis that Israel is falling short of its democratic aspirations as articulated in its Declaration of Independence, who represent actually the critical mass of Israelis who see a big gap between their democratic dreams for Israel and their perception of where the country is. Doesn't mean we all agree on much. It is a loose and complicated coalition, as liberalism oftentimes entails. People who share a broad sense of the need for stronger democratic norms and a lot of different strategies about how to get there. And the London Initiative is an attempt to try to bring us all together in partnership. That means that we are confronting difference. And it gets to what I wanted to talk about today. It's a principle that I've come to believe in deeply when it comes to doing any kind of interfaith or intergroup work, any times where you're engaging people across difference, and that is that you can't define the identity of the other based on your own frames of reference. This means that when we try to engage across difference with people who are genuinely different from us, we have to try to build relationships that are not defined by trying to put the other person or the other people into categories that work for us. We have to try to take them seriously on their own terms, even if doing so challenges us to stretch our imaginations about who they are and maybe in turn who we are. When I was in graduate school, I was very taken reading the work of the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, who argued it was the instinct of Westerners. He's coming from the world of anthropology, trying to study native peoples. He argued that's the instinct of Westerners when they encounter the natives to try to understand the natives through Western ideas and norms, using ideas like religion or Western class structure, and sometimes a particularly Western philosophical approach to even things like rational thinking. So anthropologists would try to put native peoples into categories that were intelligible based on their own understanding of how religion and rational thinking operate. And Sahlins argued that in order to engage with the other and to try to understand them, we have to be willing to set aside those cultural categories, all of which are rooted in a kind of bias, and to engage those others as they are. It's a really frustrating, exhausting, and maybe impossible thing to do. As hard as many of us may try, we are our cultural heritages and biases. Those biases shape how we understand ourselves and our world. But if the goal is really in understanding the other, if your goal is not to colonize the other politically or intellectually, you have to try to make that effort. It's a difficult challenge to do so in scholarship, but it's even harder to do that kind of thing when it comes to actually building relationships with other people across difference who are not people you're coming to study, but people with whom you're trying to build a society. This is why it's so common in interfaith encounters, for instance, that people of different faiths will gravitate to focus on what they share in common as opposed to where they disagree. Further than that, not just where they disagree, but which views they hold that are unintelligible to the other. We tend to not spend a lot of time on that. We prefer to create environments in interfaith and intergroup contexts where we start with where do we agree? Where do we resemble each other? And then use that as a means of skipping over the hard challenges. When you focus on what's held in common, it makes it easy to relate to the other through the prism of the self. In turn, it's not that surprising when those relationships fall apart, because they've never really examined the deep and sincere commitments that divide between yourself and the other person who you claim to be trying to understand. So a different way that people sometimes try to shortcut a relationship across difference is to try to identify the version of the other that best suits their own political or ideological needs and interests. We do this by building relationships only with members of another group who we define as the authentic, or worse, the good representatives of that group. American Jewish Zionists are suffering through this actually right now, as some of the historical allies of American Jews who have become anti-Zionists or outspoken critics of the state of Israel oftentimes use anti-Zionism as the litmus test to figure out who are the good Jews and who are the bad Jews. And Zionists, by the way, do the same thing to their enemies as well. In these contexts, it's common that members of a group will be expected by others to then disavow aspects of their group identity in order to curry favor and win acceptance. This forces those individuals to choose between their own people and social acceptance from others. And it also forces them to self-define not on the basis of their own commitments, but on the basis of what's considered acceptable to others. You think about how common it is now that Jews will be faced with a harassing cry of free Palestine when they're doing something banal like praying or wearing a kippah. I just read a friend of mine talking about this, eating in a restaurant, put on his kippah and got yelled free Palestine, as if to say someone else is casting upon his Jewishness a category of defining his identity in ways that are unintelligible to him. Or, in turn, how American Muslims, who I've heard about this for many years, have to defend their legitimacy as Americans by condemning terror as a prerequisite for entering into any sort of political conversation. They're expected to define as being the good Muslims in order for people to take them seriously. The very acceptance of this reality, the fact that it lives all around us, tells us that Jews and Muslims are subject to moral and political scrutiny by others as a litmus test for belonging to our societies. Litmus testing like this may be a necessary tool to figure out friend from foe. And it's not surprising that people gravitate towards these kinds of ways of engaging with others in polarizing times of war. But they are incredibly dangerous tools, these litmus tests, if our goal in the long run is to understand one another, especially if the goal is to achieve some sort of reconciliation with others. Friends don't make peace with each other. They don't need to. It's actually enemies who are the ones that need to find ways to step back from the brink. And to do so, you have to be willing to see the other through the frame of reference that they have for themselves, as opposed to the one that you provide for them. For much of this war, we've talked about this phenomenon as pertains to American Jews, and as I talked about earlier. Today, I want to turn our lens on a population that is really far less discussed in the American Jewish community, but which is essential for understanding Israel and the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is the community of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinians living inside the Green Line, combining those outside Jerusalem with full franchise, together with Jerusalem residents who have a more complicated political identity. Together, they comprise roughly 21% of the Israeli electorate. They are ethnically Palestinian, like their brothers and sisters in the West Bank and Gaza, but from a political nationality perspective, they're divided between their homeland, Palestine, and the state in which they are citizens, the state of Israel. They are thus ripe for litmus tests on all ends. I've been in rooms where non-Palestinians who define as pro-Palestine have rebuked Palestinian citizens of Israel for being insufficiently radical. Did you follow that? Non-Palestinians consider sometimes Palestinian citizens of Israel insufficiently radically pro-Palestine, and even other rooms where Palestinian citizens of Israel are indicted by Zionists, whether or not they're Israelis, sometimes it's American Jews, for not expressing sufficient loyalty to the state of Israel in either their actions or even more commonly in their affect. Meanwhile, this population might well constitute one of the most essential levers in visualizing a future for all of the people between the river and the sea. Can Israeli democracy become genuinely multi-faith and multi-ethnic? Can it guarantee that Israel is a state taking responsibility for all of its citizens? Well, if it can, that would bode well, and it would suggest that Palestinian citizens of Israel are a big piece of the story. If not, if Palestinians and Israelis are actually locked in an existential zero-sum conflict, not only is that dangerous for the future of the region and all of the people, but it also puts Palestinian citizens of Israel in a particularly precarious position. Ultimately, we, all of us who care about Israelis, Palestinians, the future of Israel, have to figure out a way to see one another as they wish to be seen, as difficult as it stretches our own conception of identity. I wanted to talk about Palestinian-Israeli identity, and one of the ideal people to talk to about this is my colleague Rula Hardal, who's a fellow at the Kogod Research Center in Jerusalem at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She's also the co-director of a NGO called Land for All. Land for All is a shared movement of Israelis and Palestinians who believe that the way towards peace, security, and stability for all passes through two independent states, Israel and Palestine, within a joint framework allowing both peoples to live together and apart. That is a complicated, beautiful mission statement. It masks some really complicated strategies towards thinking about one state, two states, all or nothing, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Rula is here together with me at this conference, one of several Palestinian citizens of Israel participating in this effort. Thank you, Rula, for joining into this conversation. I'm eager to have you on the podcast for a while, and I'm glad we were able to make it happen, even if it required traveling to a neutral location.
Thank you, Yehuda. I'm glad to be here with you. Thank you for hosting me.
Great. I'm going to start from a complicated place, which is the events of the past 2 weeks. And then we'll do that, and then we'll kind of jump deeper into these questions of identity. It's been a very, very strange 2 weeks as relates to Palestinians. It's been a very complicated 77 years, but the last 2 weeks have been kind of fascinating and instructive, and I would say dangerous. There was the combination of the Trump plan, which threatened to potentially forcibly exile 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza, and maybe a little bit strangely more close to home, especially for a lot of American Jews, was this incident of the arrest of the owners of the educational bookshop located in East Jerusalem by the Israeli police, which until very recently was under the direct supervision of the right-wing Israeli minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the tossing of books off of the bookshelves in a scene that looked really reminiscent and maybe identical to other times of great political censorship. The alleged violation was the selling of material that constitutes incitement. Those of us who live in liberal democracy know to be very fearful of that kind of activity. And in some ways, I felt and seeing a lot of outrage, especially by American Jews, but a lot of actually hesitation by Israeli Jews who said things like, well, if they're selling dangerous literature, it needs to be policed. I saw in that window a kind of illustration of the complex dynamic of what it means to be Palestinian within Israeli society. So I'd love for you to reflect on those two moments, what it has been like to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel confronting these two stories, and we can use that as a launch pad going forward.
Well, I don't see these two events as disconnected from what's going on and what I'm experiencing since October 7th. And to be much more accurate, things didn't start with October 7th for me as a Palestinian citizen in the state of Israel. And for me also personally, as someone who is dealing with the whole issue of the conflict on the academic level much more recently, directly as part of my work at A Land for All. So and also for me personally as someone who was born and raised in Israel, who lives the Israeli experience and involved in the Israeli culture, academy, and so on. But still, I spent some of my life on the other side of the so-called Green Line. I do spend a lot of my time living in Ramallah during the last couple of years. So, and that's why it's the two cases that you are raising here conceptualize something much more concentrated in the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews over the last decades, and especially over the last 1.5 years. But it's not something new, and these two cases refer to the whole problem that we are facing, which is, to conceptualize that in few words, we have two people between the river and the sea. These two people claim to be national groups and claim their belonging to this space as their homeland, as their place, and as the place where they have the right to implement their right for self-determination. This is the very basic fact and reality that we have. We have two people. The problem is that for us Palestinians, there is a continuous negation of our right by the majority of the Israeli Jews and by the official policies of the State of Israel of having this right of self-determination and of dignity and belonging to this place. And I'm doing these classifications because if we speak about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, like me, we don't claim that we want self-determination. We want dignity, and we want to be full citizens in the state of Israel, according to the political imagination that we advocate for, or we believe of having a solution for the negated problem of the self-determination of the Palestinian people. And I mean here in the framework of the political imagination of having two states. We will come back maybe later on in our conversation to the solution that we can think about, but it's related also to the collective behavior of the state of Israel and the majority of the Israeli Jews of feeling superior when it comes to their relationship with the Palestinian Arabs, regardless of their legal status, of they are citizens of the state of Israel or not. And the third point that comes to my mind when we speak about, especially the most common reaction when Mahmoud and his nephew were arrested from the bookstore in Jerusalem. Two things, actually. The Palestinian person automatically becomes the enemy. If he's a scholar, if he's a journalist, if he is a woman or a man, this is the most immediate reaction. And the second one is the insane lack of morality when it comes to the Palestinian life and the Palestinian dignity.
I think you've gotten to me at kind of the crux of the issue, which I thought we would build towards, but might as well just go for it, right? It feels to me like your last 2 points that you made, one is about the experience of feeling like there is an expression of Jewish superiority, Jewish supremacy over Palestinians, the subjugation by a majority over a minority, although I know you sometimes have resistance to the terminology majority, minority, we can come to that. But there's the third point that you raised, which seems to me different than the expression of superiority by a majority over minority, which is the construction of the Palestinian as enemy. And that feels to me like that's the dividing line, because actually I would say there are quite a few Jewish Israelis who would say, no, I don't feel a sense of supremacy over Palestinians. There are Israeli Jews who express that and believe that. I tend to believe it's actually a minority of the Israeli Jewish population. But there's a more significant percentage that would say, listen, I don't think that I'm better than Palestinians, but I fear that you're asking me to create an equal society together with people who are ethnically also part of a national group who I'm at war with. I mean, that feels like where the double bind lies, which is how do you advocate for equal rights within a society when you are constructed, rightly or wrongly, as part of the world of enemy combatants? I don't want to make the experience of persecution or discrimination that you're experiencing, I'm not trying to put it in like a positive light, but I am trying to get at, is the problem about kind of racist superiority, or is it that there continues to be an existential conflict between Jews and Palestinians, between the river and the sea? And until that gets resolved, it's hard to imagine that a Palestinian minority within Israeli society is going to feel treated like equal citizens.
It's actually both. We cannot analyze the situation and the self-perception and the experiences according to one understanding or one component of analysis. I do think that over the decades, a complex of relations and emotions have developed among the Israeli Jews and among the Arab Palestinians about the other. But I would add another layer in order to understand the picture in a better way, maybe. It's not only the Jewish supremacy that the Palestinians feel when it comes to their relationship with Israeli Jews. And it's not only the automatic treatment of them as suspicious without doing anything, but only because of being Palestinians or expressing a different attitude about things or about any event, or as enemies being part of the other national ethnic group. I do think that the lack of real knowledge about the other and the other itself is another factor that we need to pay attention to. I think that the majority of the Palestinians, and I speak to Palestinians in the West Bank. I cannot claim that I have relations with Palestinians in Gaza, but I do believe that it is the same case when it comes to this point. The majority of them don't really know Israeli Jews, never met, but, and this but is very important, they try to learn about the Israelis. They try to listen to Israeli news. They know a little bit more than the other way around. And this is one of the problems when we speak about Israeli Jews. And I don't want to speak about Jews in general in the whole world and Palestinians in the diaspora. Daniel Hartman spoke today early in the morning in this conference that we are all of us participating in about the Jewish-Israeli fear as one of the central strong emotions that conceptualize their attitudes toward the Palestinians and toward themselves and so on. I do agree with this analysis. I claim also that according to very recent polls, the majority of the Palestinian people are also stuck in this fear, in their other fear, but it's still fear. And I would add that part of this fear and part of feeling superior over the other, or feeling or describing the other, be it the Palestinian or the Jewish Israeli, as an enemy, comes from the lack of knowledge and the lack of interaction between the two people. It's more than ignorance. It's behaving like the other, and when it comes to the Israeli Jews, becoming to the illusion that the other doesn't exist. This is one of the problems of the Israeli society, the majority of the Israeli Jews, that they get used during at least the last 2 decades to come into this illusion that they live in a Western liberal democracy that has some internal problems when it comes to the definition of the state and the shrinking space of the liberal democratic values, but completely ignorance of what's happening behind the walls, what's happening in the Palestinian territories, what's happening, what the state and the army are doing and exercising every day against 5-6 million Palestinian people, without noticing that actually what is going on there behind the walls will come back to Israel. And fear usually, fear is a strong, important feeling that we need to stop by and to analyze. And one of the explanations that I give in order to understand and to deal with this very important feeling is actually the ignorance and the lack of knowledge about each other. And even inside Israel, when we speak about Israelis or Jews and Palestinians, citizens of Israel, and here we comes to a very controversial concept, the shared society. We even don't live together. We don't know a lot about each other. And again, I cannot do symmetry here between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, citizens of Israel, because we speak the language, we know the culture, we study also at schools the Tanakh, we study the Hebrew Israeli literature and so on. But the Israeli Jews don't know almost anything except a few words or maybe some stereotypes about the Palestinians in general and about the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this is something that we cannot ignore when we speak about emotions and fears and attitudes toward each other.
This would be a hard question. It's easy to understand the incentives for why Palestinians would want to be curious about Israeli Jewish life, culture, habits. How do you incentivize the majority population, and actually the one that wields greater power? How do you incentivize that population to become curious about a people who it is scared of? You could say that's rightly or wrongly, But how do you incentivize somebody to say, no, I want you to be genuinely curious about this person's identity and their background if they feel that by getting closer, it actually endangers them? And I'll add another layer to that. What happens sometimes when you get to know somebody deeply, you're capable of breaking down the bridges between you, breaking down the walls and building something serious. And sometimes when you get to know somebody deeply, you realize why you're not the same and you want to build up that bridge. So I feel that those two dynamics are very operative for Israeli Jews around Palestinians. They are both scared of an exposure to a totally competing vision for the future of the land that they hold and the power that's at their disposal. They fear terror. And they also might fear, like, well, the closer I get, the more those feelings of distance, alienation, and fear are going to be pronounced. How do you incentivize people to actually want to do that?
It's a very difficult question, and I do want to encourage people to do that. I don't think that this is the right thing to ask people to do now. It was my expectation, or I do think if we could have the situation of knowing each other better, maybe we would have a better situation now in our relations. But going back to directly to your question, I'm really not busy in doing that because I'm not sure that we are able to rebuild the trust between the two people now. It is very important to do that, but it will take decades and many years in, reaching some level of acknowledgement and knowing the other. What we need to do now is something different and not being busy with all of these questions of how to get the other to know me and how to rebuild the trust.
So what is that work? What do you think is the urgency right now?
The urgency is to start changing the whole conversation. Instead of being busy in a conversation about death and about dismantling the other and about continuous, endless war and violence, we need an understanding that it won't work. Even if the so-called plan of Trump is going partially to succeed, we will still have some millions of Palestinians. We need to acknowledge the fact that we are two people if we love each other or if we don't like each other. We need to acknowledge that we will have always differences. We will have two different narratives according this place, according Israel-Palestine, or regarding the history of the place. But still, we can try to imagine a future that can include these two contested narratives instead of trying to eliminate each other. I don't want to be heard as I'm doing some symmetry, because the power dynamics are not symmetric between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what's going on over the past 1.5 years is not also symmetric. Not underestimating what happened October 7th, but still, it's not the huge amount of suffering and killing and death and fears of what happened following October 7th for the Palestinian people. And we are still in actually the war. I don't have any illusion that the war ended. And as you mentioned, we have now another offers in order to end the war in a different way, not in a good way, in a way that, according to the international law, is crime against humanity. Yeah. When we speak about moving 2 million people from their places, from their homes, who are already distracted, and I'm speaking about Gaza, I do have only one name to label this action, which is ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
I was horrified and said so publicly. It was a horrifying declaration by Trump. It was easy to describe as ethnic cleansing, as the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing, forcing a population to relocate from where they live for whatever gain and purpose. And I have to say, in the 48 years that I've been a Zionist, because I'm 48, it was the time where I felt the most directly at odds with a prevailing opinion of Jewish Israelis who, again, I would take the generosity of saying, do not instinctively gravitate towards war crimes and ethnic cleansing, but were indulged with a fantasy. The fantasy is, if I'm in conflict with someone else, right, and I don't feel that I can ever resolve it, it is intractable. And even among peace activists, you sometimes hear about the kind of sense of permanence. The conflict won't go away. We just have to keep working towards addressing it. But you could actually come along, with this giant hand, this American hand with all of the power that's associated with it, and I could solve this by just extracting those who I construct as my enemy from its midst. Then don't tell me it's ethnic cleansing. Tell me it's solving my problems. Because I didn't even originate the idea. Someone else came along and originated the idea. So indulging that fantasy felt to me like, okay, maybe I can rationally understand it when I hear it expressed by Jewish Israelis, but the whole premise of kind of human civilization is that you're supposed to actually hear things like that and be like, you're allowed to have fantasies in your head all the time about what would make your life a lot easier as a Palestinian too, but you can't articulate them out loud. But it's interesting, Rula, to me that you are at a place where you acknowledge your experience of the war as asymmetrical, and at the same time, you are ready to actually be doing the work towards fixing the structural challenges. And it's interesting to me only because in conversations with other Palestinian colleagues over the past year and a half, it's actually very hard to get people to that place. And what is it that's, it's a banal question, what is it that's helping you to differentiate between what you experience as the problems of the war and the suffering of the war with the political and social urgency of thinking beyond the war? Because it's very, very hard for most people to think beyond the war while they're still in the war.
It's also hard for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have the feeling that it's a kind of escapism to do what I'm doing over the past year. But it's not only escapism, and despite all emotional difficulties that I do face every day, and believe me, when I speak to Israeli Jews or when I give lectures, I go out from these lectures with lack of hope and with lack of any meaning to the work that I do every day, all the day, in advocating for something different, something positive. But still, I continue to do that because of my very basic position as a Palestinian. I do it because I do care about myself, about my people, and about my role. And I consider it part of taking agency on myself and on my present and future, as well as for my people, although I don't represent anybody in Israel or in Palestine. But I do think that I do it from this very agency position, because if I claim that I am a Palestinian and I'm part of the native people who belong to this place, we need also to be able to struggle for a place for all people who already live in our homeland. The second point why I do that, because I don't have the luxury to watch the collective Israeli and Palestinian suicidal actions that we are watching, especially since October 7th. And I do that because someone or some people have to offer an alternative for the future or for the vision that the extremists, actually from both sides, but maybe much more on the Israeli government, because they have the power or more power that they offer us actually, and that they started to implement and to shape our present, and they are going to shape our future. So this is my responsibility, first of all, toward myself and toward the people that I do care about. And I do care about both people, because being a Palestinian doesn't mean that I don't care personally, morally, ethically for the Israeli Jews. Some of them are my colleagues, some of them are my friends. And without having friends or colleagues or any interaction with any Israeli Jew, I think from the very basic position of being a Palestinian and claiming to be the native and the victim over the past couple of decades, it doesn't release us from our moral responsibility toward the other.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that because you started from a place of here's the critique of attitudes of Jewish supremacy. You've talked about the Israeli government, structures of oppression, and so forth, asymmetry and war. This has been a conflict that has been prolonged for decades and decades. And we had a guest recently talking about the 1929 Hebron massacre, and there's a kind of infinite regress. The further you go back, it's like archaeology is a competitive sport in Israel, and so is history. You go further back, and it's easy to kind of paint blame at different places. I'm curious if you are comfortable offering some version of a self-critique of what needs to change in Palestinian culture, Palestinian attitudes, Palestinian politics in order to bring about any chance of reconciliation. There's no miracle scenario of a new government sails in Israel, much less that there's such profound, quick social change among Israeli Jews that they suddenly become trusting, suspending of their fear, change their attitude towards Palestinians. So what we have an understanding that I've heard from you about what needs to change in Israeli Jewish society, but what do you think needs to change on the Palestinian side?
There is a lot to be done on the Palestinian side. First of all, we need to redefine who we are, who are actually the Palestinian people. And one of the problems of the Oslo agreements that actually minimized the definition of the Palestinian people to be those who live under the Palestinian Authority. It means the Palestinians who live in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is historically not correct, and it's also unfair. And we see also now, since October 7th, the very bold role and voice of the Palestinians in the diaspora when it comes to speak to any conversation about the political situation in the present and about the future. And of course, there is the whole conversations and discussions about the role and the important role of the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, in saving both people and offering something better for the future. So this is one of the problem that actually we need, first of all, to redefine who we are, the Palestinians, and what do we want? What is our national political project? I will give you an example of one of the dramatic failures that we can see its manifestation over the past couple of months. The Palestinian people and the Israeli war against Gaza get a lot of public attraction outside Israel-Palestine. And the whole solidarity movement that started at the American and European universities and developed beyond the campuses. Do you hear something about it recently? I don't hear a lot. And you know what? Right. It's not only because people have their other concerns and problems and so on. No, I do believe that it was a real humble movement of solidarity. But you cannot expect people to continue expressing their solidarity with you when you don't know what you want, when you don't have a political project. And this is actually the most dramatic failure of the Palestinian political system and leadership and national movement over maybe the last 3 decades. So we need to go back to the basics and define who we are and what is our political and national project. And in doing so, when we reframe what do we want, what do we mean with a Palestinian state? What do we mean with the term of self-determination? What do we mean when we say we want to liberate Palestine or we want liberation? Or when we say that we want to decolonize Palestine? What is our understanding around all of these terms? And the last question is, morally and ethically, what is our attitude toward the other? The other who already lives with us, the other who control our lives, the other who can be described to be the enemy, but he is still the other, and he is going to continue living with us in the same space. And being the victim in this case as Palestinians, it doesn't give us any excuses not to deal with all of these political, national, but also moral, ethical questions, including what happened October 7. Who gave the right to Hamas, for example, to take this decision and to influence and to impact the Palestinian history, and even to put into real risk the collective existence of the Palestinian people in historic Palestine or in Israel also? What are the red lines, the moral, ethical red lines that we need also to discuss as Palestinians when it comes to our resistance and to our relationship with the occupier, okay? Or with the other, if we define it, the occupier or the settler or our colleague or our school, university. All of these questions, actually, some Palestinians started to raise all of these questions following what happened over the 1.5 years. I'm lucky to be involved in some groups that are doing these discussions. But these discussions still on the very intellectual level and still not integrated into the whole social public discourse among Palestinians. And the last problem is actually the Palestinian leadership. Can you imagine, for example, that we have such a war against the Palestinian people and especially against Gaza, and we still have the split between Hamas and Fatah? It's something that we need to be questioning as Palestinians.
Listen, I really appreciate what you said when you said who gave them the right to reshape Palestinian history in this way. And I've never heard that formulation that way. I think it will be a unique formulation for American Jews to have heard a Palestinian leader speak that way. I think it does have an effect on the language that you talked about earlier with respect to the college campuses, where terminology like the liberation of Palestine, the decolonization of Palestine, those terms are heard, whether rightly or wrongly, as inseparable from the versions of Palestinian nationalism that are eliminationist. They're seen as essentially the equivalent. You talk about the liberation of Palestine, that means the total overthrow, exile of those who are currently in power, as not let's talk about building a culture of democracy between the river and the sea, but actually something quite different. And I don't know, I think that has significant implications for those who want to see in the legitimacy of diasporic pro-Palestine protests that they belong to the same approach and worldview, when whether or not they mean what they say or not, they are experienced by diaspora Jews as engaged in basically a zero-sum approach towards the future, which I don't think is one that you hold. So I'd be curious for you to reflect on what that means to be in relationship with a version of this story that you want to identify with, but that is experienced by most Jews as being a very different kind of politics.
Yeah, I agree with you that one understanding of the whole diasporic Palestinian discourse around liberating Palestine and about having democracy from the river to the sea is, or can be, the kind of imagining the whole space as to refer to be Palestine. It was actually the proposed solution of the PLO until the mid of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, of not really acknowledging the existence of the State of Israel and offering the Jews the so-called, in the Palestinian terminology and history, the democratic solution, which is actually, we will accept the existence and the living of any Jews in historic Palestine, but under Palestinian sovereignty. Unfortunately, it's not the case. We don't have the power dynamics to go back in history and establish a Palestinian sovereignty or a Palestinian state on the whole space between the Jordan and the sea. And we don't have the regional as well as the global power dynamics that can allow something like that to happen. And finally, there's a state that acknowledged actually among the international community, which is Israel. But I'm not sure that all Palestinians in the diaspora, and also other Palestinians who live in the homeland, they refer to when they speak about liberating Palestine and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, it doesn't automatically means that they refuse any existence of Jews or the existence of the Israeli state. It's not actually the case. But still, we have differences in our narratives among Palestinians who live in the homeland and Palestinians who live in the diaspora. There is a kind of illusion among Palestinians in the diaspora that it is possible, actually, if we would have the circumstances once to live in a one democratic state, regardless of speaking or dreaming about Palestinian sovereignty or Jewish Israeli sovereignty. Those who advocate for the one democratic state, for example, I'm not against actually living in one democratic state, but we know that it's not realistic to advocate for something like that. And it's not only not realistic, it is at this moment very dangerous because this actually intersects with the very extremist Israeli right-wing people who want actually also to have the greater Israel, Eretz Israel Agdullah, and taking into consideration the power dynamics between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the support that Israel has from the majority of the international Western community, it will be a one-state reality where we have actually an apartheid state. It won't be a democratic, equal state for Israelis and Palestinians. The last point is, when speaking about the Palestinians in the diaspora and the whole fragmentation and polarization around what's going on and about imagining the future, it's somehow also patronizing from the Palestinians in the diaspora to decide for those who live in the homeland, inside Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, to wait, to continue resisting, and to continue accepting the reality, the very harsh reality, until maybe the power dynamics could change one day and we can have a new reality. And this is another reason why actually I'm doing what I'm doing. We cannot wait. Mm-hmm. The reality is not waiting also for us. And that's why we need to offer something realistic that takes into consideration the aspirations of both people, but also takes into consideration the reality on the ground and the historical context and the realistic present context that we live in. And if people later on, I don't know, after some decades or after 1-2 centuries decide to live in one state or to split into, I don't know, 5 states, it's their choice. Mm-hmm. But I'm acting from a sense of urgency that the existence, the collective national existence of the Palestinian people, including me, is in danger now. And I don't trust the values, the political, democratic, as well as the moral values of the Israeli current government and political system to decide for me and for the Israeli Jews how they see the future of this place.
Let me ask you a last question. It's a big one. And it's an opportunity maybe to talk about the work that you're doing in this NGO, Land for All, that you co-lead with an Israeli Jew, with Mai Pundak. What is your vision? And I ask that because the few remaining Israeli center-left folks who talk about a final status outcome, very rarely are people talking about peace in some sense. And I know you have a critique even of that language, but there's very little talk about the two-state solution as an ideal outcome anymore, maybe even a realistic one. But a lot of those who still argue for that will talk about it as divorce, as what we need is to perpetuate separation. And my understanding is that your view of what should happen next out of that sense of urgency for the people who live here is pointedly not the divorce model, not total separation, cultural, political, otherwise. So what is the vision that you're trying to advance in your work, rooted in the sense of urgency that you described?
Well, first of all, the vision that I'm trying to advocate for is based on realistic but also very historic or fair historic reading of the history of both people, and not only the history, the short history of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or between Israel and Palestine, which acknowledges actually the existence of a binational reality between the Jordan and the sea. And if we speak about a binational reality, then we speak about having two national groups that claim their belonging to this space. And as you know, national groups usually advocate or try to implement their very basic collective right of self-determination in terms of a modern state. And that's why we still advocate for two states, not because we are fans of the two states. The second point, it's not a classic two-state solution that's based on separation. And not only because separation is immoral, but also because separation in this case of the Israelis and the Palestinians is not realistic. Mm-hmm. You come very frequently to Jerusalem. Can you imagine a separation of the city of Jerusalem to be two cities?
No, I mean, the whole state of Israel is basically the size of the state of New Jersey. So it's functionally the equivalent of saying between exits 6 and 9 of the New Jersey Turnpike, we're going to draw a line that makes
exactly
possible. Right.
Exactly. So if we like it or not, the reality became of Israelis and Palestinians became to a big extent interrelated and intertwined. So even if we want, we cannot do this very strict separation or this total divorce. And you know what? Even in divorce, if you have kids, and we have a lot of kids here, the Israelis and the Palestinians, we need to still have some interconnections and connection in the future. We can have two separate homes for the divorced spouses. And that's what we advocate for, two independent sovereign states, because the majority of the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians still emphasize their need for a home, for a collective home, for a state, for national symbols, and so on. But in order to manage what we already share, we need to build another layer for these two states to manage what is already shared and what will continue to be shared, such as economy, borders, security issues, natural resources, and so on. So this is actually the model that I, among other people, advocate for. It's a new version of the two-state solution. It's an integrative model that has the elements of the classic two-state solution that we all know, that we all have our critics on, but has some elements from the shared reality that we live in, or if you want, the one-state reality that we live under and we need to regulate. The last point is that our model is trying also to offer solutions or creative way of thinking and solutions for the deadlocks that all of us know about the classic two-state solution, such as the settlements and the settlers, the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, and the status of the Palestinian citizens in Israel, and so on.
Rula, if this was a debate podcast, there would be a lot to go back and forth on. It's not what we seek to do in Identity Crisis. But I will tell you that I've been eager to have a conversation like this, Jewish and Palestinian, on this podcast since the war began. It's not been easy to do so. And I want to express my gratitude to you for coming on the show, and also for what I found kind of poetic tone that we carried out over the course of this conversation for a little bit more than an hour, to just talk and to know that these conversations are themselves not merely descriptive of worlds that we're trying to build, but maybe even characteristics of the worlds that we should be trying to create. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest this week, Rula Hardal. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Ben Azevedo at Bear Cave Audio, with music provided by SoCalled. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.